Certainly, this is the day that the Lord has made. We shall rejoice and be glad in it. We give thanks unto him, for he is good, and his mercy endures forever. From the rising of the sun to the going down of the same, the name of the Lord is worthy to be praised. I want to bring our attention, for the purposes of preaching, to John chapter 3, verse number 9. In John chapter 3, verse number 9, there is an inquisition made by Nicodemus within the context of his conversation with Jesus concerning the topic of being born again. Where in John chapter 3, verse number 9, it reads, Nicodemus answered and said unto him, how can these things be? Again, this question is raised as Jesus begins to present to Nicodemus the revelation of regeneration and the born-again principle that relates to us as believers in how God transforms us out of the sin nature into the process of becoming into the image of Christ. The question that Nicodemus poses to Jesus in this 9th verse of the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of Jesus Christ according to John is a very powerful question. And it is a powerful question because it is so reflective of the basic human position in terms of our relationship with God. And I say that with no regard to the status of the individual. In other words, whether you consider yourself to be a devout Christian believer who has already made a conscious profession of faith and salvation, or whether you find yourself to be one who may not be sold on this whole Jesus thing yet. At some point, you've knowingly or unknowingly copied and pasted Nicodemus's question into your own situation. All of us at some point have wondered, how can these things be? All of us have faced situations in life, whether it's dealing with the death or sickness of a family member, whether it's dealing with the tragic shifts and turns that we encounter in day-to-day life. As the song says, life is filled with swift transitions. And as we go through these swift transitions, we can oftentimes find ourselves asking the same question that Nicodemus asked. How can these things be? Surely we can ask that question here in 2020, as we've seen, if nothing else, COVID-19 changed the very fabric of our world, and for many of us, the very fabric of our faith. And as we navigate through this year alone, we can find ourselves asking the question, how can these things be? Especially when we view them in the light of God, who already is presented to us as a very complex topic when it boils down to the mind of man, the finite mind of man, attempting to comprehend an infinite God. We find ourselves asking the question, how can these things be? Just as our own place of confusion that has been created by the works of a divine and mysterious God justifies our asking of how can these things be, so too was Nicodemus's inquiry understandable. Because here, Jesus is presenting to Nicodemus new and revised insights regarding God's kingdom, as well as the whole born-again concept, a concept that was typically foreign territory to the Jews. And Jesus does all of this in a way that includes all three persons of the Trinity as being involved in this born-again process. Because in this discourse with Nicodemus, there's mention of the Father, there is mention of the Son, and there is mention of the Spirit, all being involved in what, again, was a foreign topic of being born again to Nicodemus. It's difficult to be certain as to whether John intentionally paints a Trinitarian portrait here in John 3, or even if whether Jesus is intending to be Trinitarian in his discourse. Nevertheless, all three persons are distinctively involved in a united effort towards human beings being reborn, regenerated, born again. No wonder Nicodemus is left asking the question, How can these things be? This encounter with Nicodemus is central to the overall message John desires to put forth through his gospel account, which is why it is so important that we explore this topic of how can these things be, because John's intent is to evangelically bring humanity to God, not through human ability and knowledge, but through believing on Jesus Christ, the Son of God himself, which suggests to us that the same confused state that Nicodemus is in is the same state that many individuals found themselves in concerning Jesus and the things of God during John's time. And so John endeavors to help us understand that our way to deciphering the things of God is not through our own intellect, not through our own wisdom, but it is through the Son, the incarnate, Logos Word of God. Written during a time where the heretical teachings of Stoicism and Gnosticism were teaching that human knowledge was the way to get up to God, the author of John writes an account of the gospel of Jesus that teaches true knowledge. It is that divine form of knowledge and wisdom that derives directly from God and cannot be properly acquired by human effort. For John, true knowledge is not that which can hopefully lead humanity to God, but true knowledge actually came down to man in the form of his Son, the incarnate Word of God, the Logos, Jesus Christ. And it is our acceptance of and belief in this incarnate Logos that leads humanity to the true light. This conversation in John chapter 3 between Jesus and Nicodemus concerning being born again may have been included for this very reason, as added support for the author's push to presenting Jesus as the light of the world, the true source of knowledge, and thus the true way to God. The 19th century Protestant theologian Karl Barth held true to a theology that is similar to what we find here in John's gospel. Barth was a strong proponent of what he called the top-down brand of revelation. Barth believed that, and I quote, "Human reason has no power to attain to the knowledge of God, which is given only in God's gracious revelation in Jesus Christ. This revelation comes from God to man and is contrasted with religion, which is described as man's sinful attempt to grasp God and which ends only in distortion and idolatry," unquote. For Barth, then, and in like manner for the author of John, an attempt to decipher the things of God using only the knowledge of man as the starting point can lead only to the types of questions that sound much like the one that Nicodemus asks here in John 3 and 9. How can these things be? When we try to decipher the Trinitarian doctrine through our own wisdom and through our own knowledge, and try to decipher how Jesus can be both fully divine and fully human at the same time, when we try to decipher how the Son, the Father, and the Spirit are distinct yet one, through our own knowledge, through our own wisdom, we will be left with the question, how can these things be? When we try to figure out how God can heal a cancer-stricken patient, when we try to figure out how God can turn our situation around in the blink of an eye, when we try to figure out how God can bring us from a sinful past into a righteous present and future with our own wisdom and with our own knowledge, we will be left with the question, how can these things be? Just like you and I do oftentimes, Nicodemus makes his argument from an intellectual level, which is why he could not comprehend the regenerative work of being born again. He was attempting to use human knowledge and logic to understand. Logic that places salvation in the hands of man from a man to God perspective, not realizing it can only be done from a God to man perspective. And thanks be to God that he has paved the way for revelation to flow from God to man in the person of God the Son. That is why Jesus says what he says in verse 13 of chapter 3 in the Gospel of John, and no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven. God bless you.